So, hello and welcome back yet again to another evening with Mary Shelley's wonderful, and that's not even an exaggeration. I'm really enjoying this. Mary Shelley's wonderful book, Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus. We spent the first little chunk of the book getting to know the captain of the ship who is off to discover the lands of the North Pole. And then we met Victor Frankenstein, our main character. I mean, after all, it is the one the book is named after, so obviously he's the main character. And I think it's kind of funny that when you say Frankenstein, everybody thinks of the monster. But Frankenstein was the scientist, and he is definitely into sciences. So we're going to jump in, and we are going to read another 2 chapters because that just seems like a good number. And yeah, I am really enjoying this. I'm kicking myself. I think I would have really enjoyed this as a teenager as well. But you know what? Better late than never. So we are going to jump into Volume 1 of Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, beginning with Chapter 5. Glasses so I can actually see. It was on a dreary night of November that I beheld the accomplishment of my toil. With an anxiety that almost amounted to agony, I collected the instruments of life around me that I might infuse a spark of being into the lifeless thing that lay at my feet. It was already 1 in the morning. The rain pattered dismally against the panes, and my candle was nearly burnt out when, by the glimmer of the half-extinguished light, I saw the dull yellow eye of the creature open. It breathed hard, and a convulsion animated its limbs. How can I describe my emotions at this catastrophe? Or how delineate the wretch whom such infinite pains and care I had endeavored to form? His limbs were in proportion, and I had selected his features as beautiful. Beautiful. Great God! His yellow skin scarcely covered the work of the muscles and arteries beneath his hair. His hair was a lustrous black, and it was flowing, his teeth pearly whiteness, but these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes that seemed almost of the same color as the dun white sockets in which they were set. His shriveled complexion, the straight black lips. The different accidents of life are not so changeable as the feelings of human nature. I had worked hard for nearly 2 years for the sole purpose of infusing life into an inanimate body. For this, I had deprived myself of rest and health. I had desired it with an ardor that far exceeded moderation, but now that I had finished, the beauty of the dream vanished, and a breathless horror and disgust filled my heart. Unable to endure the aspect of the being I had created, I rushed out of the room and continued a long time traversing my bedchamber, unable to compose my mind enough to sleep. At length, lassitude succeeded to the tumult I had before endured, and I threw myself on the bed in my clothes, endeavoring to seek a few moments of forgetfulness, but it was in vain. I slept, but I was disturbed by the wildest dreams. I thought I saw Elizabeth in the bloom of health walking in the streets of Ingolstadt. Delighted and surprised, I embraced her, but as I imprinted the first kiss on her lips, they became livid with the hue of death. Her features appeared to change, and I thought that I held the corpse of my dead mother in my arms. A shroud enveloped her form, and I could see the grave worms crawling in the folds of the flannel. I started from my sleep with horror. A cold dew covered my forehead, my teeth chattered, and every limb became convulsed when, by the dim and yellow light of the moon, as it found its way through the window shutters, I beheld the wretch, the miserable monster whom I had created. He held up the curtain of my bed, and his eyes, if eyes they may be called, were fixed on me. His jaws opened, and he muttered some inarticulate sounds, while a grin wrinkled his cheek. He might have spoken, but I did not hear. One hand was stretched out, seemingly to detain me, but I escaped and rushed downstairs. I took refuge in the courtyard belonging to the house which I inhabited, where I remained the rest of the night, walking up and down in the greatest agitation, listening attentively, catching and fearing each sound as if it were to announce the approach of the demoniacal corpse to which I had so miserably given life. Oh, no mortal could support the horror of that countenance. A mummy, again, endured with animation, could not be so hideous as that wretch. I had gazed on him while unfinished. He was ugly then, but when those muscles and joints were rendered capable of motion, it became a thing such as even Dante could not have conceived. I passed the night wretchedly. Sometimes my pulse beat so quickly and hardly that I felt the palpitation of every artery. At others, I nearly sank to the ground through languor and extreme weakness. Mingled with this horror, I felt the bitterness of disappointment. Dreams that had been my food and pleasant rest for so long a space had now become a hell to me, and the change was so rapid, the overthrow was so complete. Morning, dismal and wet, at length dawned, and discovered to my sleepless, aching eyes the church of Ingolstadt, its white steeple and clock, which indicated the 6th hour. The porter opened the gates of the court, which had that night been my asylum, and I issued into the streets, pacing them with quick steps, as if I sought to avoid the wretch whom I feared every turning of the street would present to my view. I did not dare return to the apartment which I inhabited, but felt impelled to hurry on, although drenched by the rain which poured from a black, comfortless sky. I continued walking in this manner for some time, endeavoring by bodily exercise to ease the load that weighed upon my mind. I traversed the streets without any clear conception of where I was or what I was doing. My heart palpitated in the sickness of fear, and I hurried with irregular steps, not daring to look around me. Like one on a lonesome road who doth walk in fear and dread, and having once turned round walks on, and turns no more his head, because he knows a frightful fiend doth close behind him tread. Continuing thus, I came at length opposite to an inn, at which the various diligences and carriages usually stopped. Here I paused. I know not why, but I remained some minutes with my eyes fixed on a coach that was coming towards me from the other end of the street. As it drew near, I observed that it was the Swiss diligence. It stopped just where I was standing, and on the door being opened, I perceived Henry Clerval, who on seeing me instantly sprang out. "My dear Frankenstein," he exclaimed, How glad I am to see you! How fortunate you should be here at the very moment of my alighting!" Nothing, nothing could equal my delight on seeing Clerval. His presence brought back my thoughts to my father, Elizabeth, and all those scenes of home so dear to my recollection. I grasped his hand and in a moment forgot my horror and misfortune. I felt suddenly, and for the first time in many months, a calm and serene joy. I welcomed my friend, therefore, in the most cordial manner, and we walked towards my college. Clerval continued talking for some time about our mutual friends and his own good fortune in being permitted to come to Ingolstadt. "You may easily believe," he said, "how great was the difficulty to persuade my father that all necessary knowledge was not comprised in the noble art of bookkeeping, and indeed, I believe I left him incredulous to the last, for his constant answer to my unwearied entreaties was the same as that to the Dutch schoolmaster in the Vicar of Wakefield. 'I have 10,000 florins a year without Greek. I eat heartily without Greek.' But his affection for me at length overcame his dislike of learning, and he has permitted me to undertake a voyage of discovery to the land of knowledge. It gives me the greatest delight to see you, but let me tell you how, but tell me how you left my father, brothers, and Elizabeth." "Very well, and very happy. Only a little uneasy that they hear from you so seldom. By the by, I mean to lecture you a little on their account myself. But, my dear Frankenstein," he said, stopping short and gazing full in my face, "I did not before remark how very ill you appear, so thin and pale, and look as if you have been watching for several nights." "You have guessed right. I have lately been so deeply engaged in one occupation that I have not allowed myself enough rest, as you can see. But I hope, I sincerely hope, that all these employments are now at an end, and I am at length finally free." I trembled excessively. I could not endure to think of, and even less allude to, the occurrences of the preceding night. I walked with a quick pace, and we soon arrived at my college. I then reflected, and the thought made me shiver, that the creature whom I had left in my apartment might still be there, alive and walking about. I dreaded to behold this monster, but I feared still more that Henry should see him. Entreating him, therefore, to remain a few moments at the bottom of the stairs, I darted up to my own room. My hand was already on the lock of the door before I recollected myself. I then paused, and a cold shivering came over me. I threw the door forcibly open, as children are accustomed to do when they expect a spectre to stand in waiting for them on the other side, but nothing appeared. I stepped fearfully in. The apartment was empty, and my bedroom was also freed from its hideous guest. I could hardly believe that so great a good fortune could have befallen me, but when I became assured that my enemy had indeed fled, I clapped my hands for joy and ran down to Clerval. We ascended into my room, and a servant presently brought breakfast, but I was unable to contain myself. It was not only joy that possessed me. I felt my flesh tingle with an excess of sensitivities, and my pulse beat rapidly. I was unable to remain for a single instant in the same place. I jumped over the chairs, clapped my hands, and laughed aloud. Clerval at first attributed my unusual spirits to joy upon his arrival, but when he observed me more attentively, he saw wildness in my eyes for which he could not account, and my loud, unrestrained, heartless laughter frightened and astonished him. "My dear Victor," he cried, "what, for God's sake, is the matter? Do not laugh in that manner. How ill you are! What is the cause of all this?" "Do not ask me," I cried, putting my hands before my eyes, for I thought I saw the dreaded specter glide into the room. "He can tell! Oh, save me! Save me!" I imagined that the monster seized me. I struggled and fell down in a fit. Poor Clerval. What must have been his feelings? A meeting which he anticipated with such joy strangely turned to bitterness, but I was not the witness of his grief, for I was lifeless and did not recover my senses for a long, long time. This was the commencement of a nervous fever, which confined me for several months. During all that time, Henry was my only nurse. I afterwards learned that, knowing my father's advanced age and unfitness for such a long journey, and how wretched my sickness would make Elizabeth, he spared them this grief by concealing the extent of my disorder. He knew that I could not have a more kind and attentive nurse than he was, and firm in the hope he felt of my recovery, he did not doubt that, instead of doing harm, he performed the kindest action that he could to them. But I was, in reality, very ill, and surely nothing but the unbounded and unremitting attention of my friend could have restored me to life. The form of the monster on whom I had bestowed existence was forever in front of my eyes, and I raved incessantly, which concerned him. Doubtless my words surprised Henry. He at first believed them to be the wanderings of my disturbed imagination, but the pertinacity with which I continually reoccurred to the same subject persuaded him that my disorder indeed owed its origin to some uncommon and terrible event. By very slow degrees, and with frequent relapses that alarmed and grieved my friend, I recovered. I remember the first time I became capable of observing outward objects with any kind of pleasure. I perceived that the fallen leaves had disappeared, and that the young buds were shooting forth from the trees that shaded my window. It was a divine spring, and the season contributed greatly to my convalescence. I felt also sentiments of joy and affection revive in my bosom. My gloom disappeared, and in a short time I had become as cheerful as before I was attacked by that fatal passion. "Dearest Clerval," I exclaimed, "how kind, how very good you are to me! This whole winter, instead of being spent in study as you had promised yourself, was consumed in my sick room. How may I ever repay you? I feel the greatest remorse for the disappointment of which I have been the occasion, but you will forgive me." "You will repay me entirely if you do not discompose yourself, but get well as quick as you can. And since you appear in such good spirits, I may speak to you on one subject, may I not?" I trembled. One subject? What could it be? Could he allude to an object on which I dare not even think? "Compose yourself," said Clerval, who observed my change of color. "I will not mention it if it agitates you, but your father and cousin would be very happy if they received a letter from you in your own handwriting. They hardly know how ill you have been, and are uneasy by your long silence." "Is that all, dear Henry? How could you suppose that my first thought would not fly towards those dear, dear friends who I love and are so deserving of my love?" "If this is your present temper, my friend," said Henry, "you will perhaps be glad to see that a letter has been lying here some days for you. It is from your cousin, I believe." And that is actually the end of chapter 5. I have less respect for Frankenstein right now. Put a pin in that, and hopefully I'll remember it after we read chapter 6. Give me a minute for a drink. Chapter 6. Clerval then put the following letter into my hands. It was from my own Elizabeth. "My dearest cousin, you have been ill, very ill, and even the constant letters of dear kind Henry are not sufficient to reassure me on your account. You are forbidden to write, to hold a pen, yet one word from you, dear Victor, is necessary to calm our apprehensions. For a long time I have thought that each post would bring this line, and my persuasions have restrained my uncle from undertaking a journey to Ingolstadt. I have prevented his encountering the inconveniences and perhaps dangers of so long a journey, yet how often have I regretted not being able to perform it myself. I figure to myself that the task of attending on your sickbed has devolved on some mercenary old nurse who could never guess your wishes, nor minister to them with the care and affection of your poor cousin. Yet that is over now. Clerval writes that indeed you are getting better. I eagerly hope you will confirm this intelligence soon in your own handwriting. Get well, and return to us. You will find a happy, cheerful home and friends who love you dearly. Your father's health is vigorous, and he asks but to see you, but to be assured that you are well, and not a care will ever cloud his benevolent countenance. How pleased you would be to remark the improvement of our Ernest. He is now 16 and full of activity and spirit. He is desirous to be a true Swiss and to enter into the foreign service, but we cannot part with him, at least until his elder brother return to us. My uncle is not pleased with the idea of a military career in a distant country, but Ernest never had your power of application. He looks on study as an odious fetter. His time is spent in the open air, climbing the hills or rowing on the lake. I fear that he will become an idler unless we yield the point and permit him to enter on the profession he has selected. Little alteration, except in the growth of our dear children, has taken place since you left us. The blue lake and snow-clad mountains, they never change, and I think our placid home and our contented hearts are regulated by the same laws. My trifling occupations take up my time and amuse me, and I'm rewarded for any exertion by seeing none but happy, kind faces around me. Since you left us, but one change has taken place in our little household. Do you remember on what occasions Justine Moritz entered our family? Probably you do not. I will relate her history, therefore, in a few words. Madame Moritz, her mother, was a widow with 4 children, of whom Justine was the third. The girl had always been the favorite of her father, but through a strange perversity, her mother could not endure her, and after the death of Mr. Moritz, treated her poorly. My aunt observed this, and when Justine was 12 years of age, prevailed on her mother to allow her to live in our home. The republican institutions of our country have produced simpler and happier manners than those which prevail in the great monarchies that surround it, and hence there is less distinction between the several classes of its inhabitants, and the lower orders, being neither so poor or despised, their manners are far more refined and moral. A servant in Geneva, does not mean the same thing as a servant in France or England. Justine, thus received in our family, learned the duties of a servant, a condition which, in our fortunate country, does not include the idea of ignorance and sacrifice of the dignity of the human being. Justine, you may remember, was a great favorite of yours, and I recollect you once remarked that if you were in ill humor, one glance from Justine could dissipate it, for the same reason that Ernesto gives concerning the beauty of Angelica. She looked so frank-hearted and happy. My aunt conceived a great attachment for her, by which she was induced to give her an education superior to that which she had first intended. This benefit was fully repaid. Justine was the most graceful little creature in the world. I do not mean that she made any professions, but I never heard one pass her lips. But you could see by her eyes that she almost adored her protectress. Although her disposition was gay, and in many respects inconsiderate, she paid the greatest attention to every gesture of my aunt. She thought her the model of all excellence, and endeavored to imitate her phrases and manners, so even now she often reminds me of her. When my dearest aunt died, everyone was too much occupied with their own grief to notice poor Justine, who had attended her illness with anxious affection. Poor Justine was very ill, but other trials were reserved for her. One by one, her brothers and sister died, and her mother, with the exception of her neglected daughter, had been left childless. The conscience of the woman was troubled, and she began to think of the deaths of her favorites as a judgment from heaven to chastise her partiality. She was a Roman Catholic, and I believe her confessor confirmed the idea which she had conceived. Accordingly, a few months after your departure for Ingolstadt, Justine was called home by her repentant mother. Poor girl! She wept when she quit our house. She was much altered since the death of my aunt. Grief had given softness and a winning mildness to her manners, which had before been remarkable for vivacity. Nor was her residence at her mother's house of a nature to restore her to gaiety. The poor woman was very vacillating in her repentance. She sometimes begged Justine to forgive her unkindness, but much oftener accused her of having caused the death of her brothers and sister. Perpetual fretting at length threw Madame Moritz into a decline which at first increased her irritability, but she is now at peace forever. She died on the first approach of cold weather at the beginning of this last winter, and Justine has returned to us, and I assure you I love her tenderly. She is very clever and gentle and extremely pretty. As I mentioned before, her face and expressions continually remind me of my dear aunt. I must also say a few words to you, dear cousin, of little darling William. I wish you could see him. He is very tall for his age, with sweet, laughing blue eyes, dark eyelashes, and curly hair. When he smiles, two little dimples appear on each cheek, which are rosy with good health. He has already had one or two little wives, but Louisa Byron is his favorite, a pretty little girl of 5 years of age. Now, dear Victor, I dare say you wish to be indulged in a little gossip concerning the good people of Geneva. The pretty Miss Mansfield has already received the congratulatory visits on her approaching marriage with a young Englishman, John Melbourne, Esquire. Her ugly sister, Manon, married Monsieur Duvard, a rich banker, last autumn. Your favorite schoolfellow, Louis Manoir, has suffered misfortune since the departure of Clerval from Geneva, but He's already recovered his spirits and is reported to be on the point of marrying a very lively, pretty Frenchwoman, Madame Trevanier. She's a widow and much older than Manoir, but she is much admired and a favorite of everybody. I have now written myself into better spirits, dear cousin, but my anxiety returns upon me as I conclude. Write, dear Victor. One line, one word would be a blessing to us. 10,000 thanks to Henry for his kindness, his affection, his many letters. We are most sincerely grateful. Adieu, my cousin, and take care of yourself. And I entreat you, write Elizabeth Lavenza, Geneva. Dear, dear Elizabeth, I said, when I had read her letter, I will write instantly and relieve them from anxiety that they are feeling. I wrote, and this exertion greatly fatigued me, but my convalescence had commenced and proceeded regularly. In another fortnight, I was able to leave my chamber. One of my first duties on my recovery was to introduce Clerval to the several professors of the university. In doing this, I underwent a kind of rough usage, ill befitting the wounds that my mind had sustained. Ever since that fatal night, at the end of my labors and beginning of my misfortunes, I had conceived a violent antipathy, even to the name natural philosophy. When I was otherwise restored to health, the sight of a chemical instrument would renew all the agony of my nervous symptoms. Henry saw this, and he had removed all my apparatuses from view. He had also changed my apartment, for he perceived that I had acquired a dislike for the room which had previously been my laboratory. But these cares of Clerval were made of no avail when I visited the professors. Waldman inflicted torture when he praised with kindness and warmth the astonishing progress I had made in science. But he soon perceived that I disliked the subject. He could not guess the real cause. He attributed my feelings to modesty, and so changed the subject from my improvement to the sciences itself, with a desire, as I evidently could see, of drawing me out. What could I do? He meant to please me, but he tormented me. I felt as if he had placed carefully, one by one, in my view, those instruments which were to be afterwards used in putting me to a slow, cruel death. I writhed under his words, yet dared not exhibit the pain that I felt. Clerval, whose eyes and feelings were always quick in discerning the sensation of others, declined the subject, alleging in excuse his total ignorance, and then the conversation took a more general turn. I thanked my friend from the heart, but I did not speak. I saw plainly that he was surprised, but he never attempted to draw my secret from me, and although I loved him with a mixture of affection and reverence that knew no bounds, I could never persuade myself to confide to him that event which was so often present to my recollection, but which I feared the details of to another would only impress more deeply. Monsieur Kemp was not equally docile, and in my condition at that time of almost insupportable sensitivities, his harsh, blunt economicisms gave me even more pain than the benevolent approbation of Monsieur Waldman. "Damn the fellow!" cried he. "Why, Monsieur Silval, I assure you he has outstripped us all. Aye, stay if you please, but it's none the less true. A youngster who but a few years ago believed in Cornelius Agrippa as firmly as the gospel has now set himself at the head of the university, and if he is not soon pulled down, we will all be out of countenance. Aye, he continued, observing my face, expressing suffering. Monsieur Frankenstein is modest, an excellent quality in a young man. Young men should be diffident of themselves, you know, Monsieur Clerval. I was myself when I was young, but that wears off in a very short time. Monsieur Kemp had now commenced a eulogy on himself, which happily turned the conversation from a subject that was so annoying to me. Clerval had never sympathized in my taste for natural science, and his literary pursuits differed wholly from those which had occupied me. He came to the university with a design of making himself a complete master of the Oriental languages, and thus he should open a field for the plan of life that he had marked out for himself. Resolved to pursue no inglorious career, he turned his eyes towards the East as affording a scope for his spirit of expertise. The Persian, Arabic, and Sanskrit languages engaged his attention, and I was easily induced to enter on the same studies. Idleness had always been irksome to me, and now that I wished to fly from my reflection and fly away from my former studies, I felt relief in being the fellow pupil with my friend, and I found not only instruction, but consolation in the works of those authors. I did not, like him, attempt a critical knowledge of their dialect, for I did not contemplating making any use of them other than temporary amusement. I read merely to understand their meaning, and they well repaid my labors. Their melancholy is soothing, their joy is elevating to a degree I never experienced in studying the authors of any other country. When you read their writings, life appears to consist in a warm sun and garden of roses, in the smiles and frowns of a fair enemy, and in the fire that consumes your own heart. How different from the manly and heroic poetry of Greece and Rome. Summer passed in these occupations, and my return to Geneva was fixed for the latter end of autumn, but being delayed by several accidents, winter and snow had arrived, and the roads deemed impassable, so my journey was delayed until the ensuing spring. I felt this delay very bitterly, for I longed to see my native town and my beloved friends. My return had only been delayed so long from an unwillingness to leave Clerval in a strange place before he came acquainted with any of the inhabitants. Our winter, however, was spent cheerfully, and although the spring was uncommonly late, when it came, its beauty compensated for its lateness. The month of May had already commenced, and I expected the letter daily which was to fix the date of my departure, when Henry proposed a pedestrian tour of the environs of Ingolstadt, so I might bid a personal farewell to the country I had so long inhabited. I acceded with pleasure to this proposition. I was fond of exercise, and Clerval had always been my favorite companion in the rambles of this nature that I had taken among the scenes of my native home. We passed a fortnight in these rambles. My health and spirit had been long restored, and they gained additional strength from the air. The very air I breathed, the natural incidents of our progress, and with the conversation of my friend. Studying had before secluded me from the intercourse of my fellow creatures and rendered me unsocial, but Clerval called forth the better feelings of my heart, and he again taught me to love the aspect of nature and the cheerful faces of children. Excellent friend, how sincerely did you love me and endeavor to elevate my mind until it was on a level with your own? A selfish pursuit had cramped and narrowed me until your gentleness and affection warmed and opened my senses. I became the same happy creature who a few years ago, loved and beloved by all, had no sorrow or cares. When happy, inanimate nature had the power of bestowing upon me the most delightful sensations. A serene sky and verdant fields filled me with ecstasy. The present season was truly divine. The flowers of spring bloomed in the hedges, while those of summer were already in bud. I I was undisturbed by thoughts which during the preceding year had pressed on me, notwithstanding my endeavors to throw them off with an invincible burden. Her, Her, Henry, I don't know why I wanted to call him Harry. Henry rejoiced in my gaiety and sincerely sympathized with my feelings. He exerted himself to amuse me, while he expressed the sensations that were filling his soul. The resources of his mind on this occasion were truly astonishing, and his conversation was full of imagination, and quite often, in an imitation of the Persian and Arabic writers, he invented tales of wonderful fancy and passion. At other times, he repeated my favorite poems or drew me out into arguments which he then supported with great ingenuity. We returned to our college on a Sunday afternoon. The peasants were dancing, and everyone that we met appeared gay and happy. My own spirits were quite high, and I went bounding along with feelings of unbridled joy and hilarity. And that is the end of chapter 6. What is it they always say? Pride goeth before the fall. I feel like Victor is about to have quite a fall because he seems to be referring to his best friend in the past tense, which makes me wonder what's about to happen. Which unfortunately will not be on Fridays. I have decided that Fridays are my night, not really off, but my night when I don't do a book upload, since I do a live stream on Friday nights, and so I will be streaming on Friday. Join me if you want to. We'll probably be playing The Sims. I play silly games. It's a lot of fun if you're into that sort of thing. But we will be back Saturday to see what is going to go on in this book. But yeah, the pin that I put in the Frankenstein thing, I have lost a big old chunk of respect. Like, I was kind of liking Victor. He seemed bright, a little full of himself, but probably not something that would be surprising considering the time period. But to bring a monster to life, and it seemed like the creature wasn't being violent, it was just ugly, and then to like just sort of forget about it. We don't know where this thing is. We don't know what it's doing, and Victor does not seem to care. Victor's like, la 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 la, I made a monster and now I don't care. Yeah, Victor, you're gonna have to claw your way back into my good graces, if that's even possible. I would almost say that in a lot of ways, I would label him as a coward. Or maybe craven. I'm not sure which one would fit better. But we shall see. I'm still enjoying this greatly. So I will see you guys Saturday night for another couple of chapters. Thank you so much. Please do hit the thumbs up button. I was like the like, thumbs up. I was going to put like and thumbs up into the same word. Please hit the thumbs up button if you don't mind. It does always make me smile. And I will see you guys Saturday.